Okay, welcome back. This is going to be Unit 3, Chapter 9, and this is going to be about policy choice and evaluation. I'll just cover a couple things here. I just really wanted to talk about the different ways by which we may evaluate policy, right? There are a lot of different ways, and there are a lot of different people and groups that will have differing opinions on these things, right? And so the most obvious from just like an economic perspective is the cost benefit analysis, right? Like we all know how cost benefit works. Um, the capitalism requires a profit, right? And so there's always going to be some sort of cost benefit analysis. Now, how we define benefit and how we define cost, because a lot of times the sort of social costs that are paid by individuals through things like pollution, et cetera, are not taken into account, right? But generally, that's how these things work. Okay, number two, I wanted to point out there can be very big distributional issues. And this can be urban rural, right? Where we know it's more expensive to provide energy generally to rural places just because of the sprawl. There can be regional differences. We touched a little bit earlier in the chapter on sort of Oregon or California and the West Coast and how they see energy, and a place like West Virginia or Texas who relies on, say, coal or gas for big parts of their economy, right, and for their labor force too. So these things can come into play as well, right? Race can be a big factor. Um, we know a lot of the people who live in the worst affected polluted areas like Cancer Alley around Louisiana, Mississippi, tend to be Black poor people, right? And so usually minorities and the very poor pay the brunt of this stuff, um, of these what we call externalities. And that's not only in the United States, right, or other developed countries, right? So in domestically, the poor and minorities tend to pay the highest sort of social cost, but also internationally, where we know that the developing countries are taking the brunt of this stuff too. Not only when it comes to things like pollution, but also sort of the repercussions of climate change potentially, because a lot of those populations live near coastlines, right? Okay. Oh, one more thing on the sort of class distinctions too is that a lot, not only the externalities that we just talked about, right, but a lot of the sort of taxes that are involved in cleaning up the environment, right, like gasoline taxes and stuff, they also hit the poor hardest, right, because things like gasoline make up a much larger portion of their total income than the wealthy, and so a slight change in the gas tax isn't going to affect someone with wealth, but it might lead to some devastating consequences for the very poor, right? We can also base things on sort of macroeconomic concerns, right? So, how does this affect things like GDP growth? How does it affect inflation? How does it affect like unemployment rates, right? And then also trade or debt imbalances. Those things can become very important too, especially sort of trade imbalances for countries like South Korea or Japan, especially during World War II, right? Like Japan couldn't get oil because of the embargo, which devastated their economy, really crippled their military. So these sorts of things can also become important. Another one we've talked about a few times is political feasibility. Can you even get it passed through the voters, right? And so some of these things are like political suicide for people who have elections coming up or are in swing districts or these sorts of things, right? And it could cause things like protests and job losses and the worst, right? Changing voting patterns, at least from the politician's perspective. Um, we've talked a lot about implementing and monitoring concerns and whether that's even feasible. And then finally, I just wanted to bring up national security, right? We also have national security concerns around nuclear power, around how much of our energy we import, right? We recently became a net exporter for the first time ever in our history. Uh, all of these sorts of things. And then finally, who are we funding, right? Because a lot of oil and petroleum products and even rare earth minerals that are going to be vital for things like the battery industry are from our enemies, right? Our dire enemies, Venezuela, China. I guess Saudi Arabia is not an enemy, but there's a tense relationship there, which we'll talk about in the next section. So there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different prisms through which to view these things. Is I guess my biggest point in this chapter. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks again for being here. I'll see you for the next one.